Okay, we're coming to the home stretch now. We're in Genesis 50. We started last time, this last chapter of Genesis, and we want to try to complete it today and put the finishing touches on the book of Genesis. So let's get started. We left off last time with Joseph's and his father, and Jacob's now his death and his funeral. And if you remember, it was a pretty impressive funeral arrangements for him. Some of the things that he insisted, if you remember, what was the most important thing for Jacob regarding his funeral arrangements?
To be brought back home to his family burial site.
Yeah, it's to go back to the land of Canaan to be buried with where Abraham and Sarah was buried, where Isaac and Rebekah were buried, and also where his wife Leah was buried. So that he would be with them. Why is that such a big deal? In fact, I believe of all the things that Jacob did in his life, it was that moment that the book of Hebrews highlights
Mhm,
as an act of faith.
mhm.
Why is that an act of faith for Jacob to insist that he be buried in Canaan and not in Egypt?
Shows confidence in God's previous promises.
Yeah, it shows confidence. This is where, if you think about it, it's like you want to be buried in a place where your future descendants will be able to visit your memorial, be able to attend. You don't, if you care about these things, you want to be buried in a place where your sons and grandchildren and great grandchildren will be nearby to remember you, to remember your legacy. And Jacob insists on being buried in Canaan, even though none of his sons are there. None of his grandchildren are there. In fact, none of his descendants are going to be there for another, I think, 400 years before they get there. But he is so confident in God's promise. God promised him that land, and therefore that's where he's going to be buried, and that's where he will be remembered. So it takes them, what, 40 days to embalm him? I don't know why it takes that long, but it does. And they weep, even the Egyptians weep for him for 70 days, and they have a huge processional as they bring him to the land of Canaan and bury him there, and then they return. So we'll pick it up from there. Verse 15. Let's take it from 15. I'm going to put a little page break here so it can be all on the same. It'll let me. There we go. Page break here. So let's do 15 down to 21. And Teresa, would you start us off with this one here?
Sure.
15.
When Joseph saw that his father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for I am in the place of God." Keep going.
Yeah, to 21.
Okay, sorry. "Do not fear, for I am in the place of God. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them.
Okay. So Joseph's father is dead. Now Jacob has died, and Joseph's brothers uh, have a fear. Uh, and what are they afraid of?
He's going to take revenge.
Yeah, that what did it say? That Joseph will hate us and pay us back for for all the evil that they did to him. And I mean, it is a terrifying prospect when you think about it. They betrayed him. They were going to kill him.
Mhm.
They did
Everyone is
great evil against him, and his suffering all those years was because of them, what they did. And now the tables turned. They are completely at his mercy. Joseph can snap his fingers and he can put them all to death right there, and no one can stop him because Pharaoh will do whatever Joseph wants. And Joseph can give the word, and they're dead men. A terrifying place. And you know that they're thinking, why are they suddenly afraid now that Joseph's father has died? Why that their father was dead? Why is that?
Well, because they probably felt that he wouldn't do it. And he wanted his father and his younger brother. And so as long as they were still alive, he wouldn't do it to put any separation between him and his father. But now that the father's gone, that protection seems to be gone.
Yeah, yeah. Especially now that Jacob has died, because they know Jacob. They're probably thinking, look, Joseph hates us. I mean, he's pretending maybe to be, but he loves his father. They know that, and they know that he won't touch them while Jacob's alive. Remember, that's what Esau was thinking. Do you remember? What was Esau's plan with Jacob? He was going to kill him, if you remember. But when was he going to kill him?
After his father died.
He was going to wait until Isaac. He didn't want to bring grief to his father. Um, and so they're thinking the same way, that they're afraid that Joseph would be like Esau. Esau, as soon as his father died, would have killed Jacob, uh, knowing that Joseph would not want to grieve his father. But now that Jacob's out of the way, okay, it's a free game here. He can do as he pleases.
I really
So-
like what he says here when he says, "Do not fear, for I am in the place of God."
Yeah, it's interesting. He says it as a question mark, actually. He says, "For am I in the place of God? Do not fear." And he says, I'm not God here, you
Mhm.
know. Yeah, absolutely. We'll come down to that in a second. But first, what Joseph's brothers send a message. Joseph, the brothers' message to Joseph. What is their message?
Please forgive us.
And
Yes.
Dad told us to tell you this.
Yes. First, appealing to the father. Yeah, Dad commanded us to ask for forgiveness. Please forgive them. Okay. And so it's actually kind of touching. I mean, I think when we read this too, we might be wondering, did Jacob really tell him that, or are they just making that up? But when we read the scriptures, I can take it at face value that, yeah, what they say is true, unless it says they deceived him and said otherwise, that Jacob probably did give them the command. Once Jacob knew what happened, when Joseph's found, he obviously knows what's going on, knows the whole story now. And Jacob, as a father would want nothing more than reconciliation with his sons, that there would be peace between them. And so he tells them what they need to do, and they do it. So
I have to tell you, you're giving them more credit than I would.
yeah, well, maybe so, but don't, again, that's why I say don't read things that are not there. If it says it's what happened, then that's what happened. We don't have to think that they're lying to Joseph. They're clearly not. It's the point is, this is a really beautiful moment of reconciliation between them.
Well, and you have to remember that Joseph put them through a series of very specific tests
Mhm.
to find out if they had changed.
Yeah, and
You
they
know,
were
so-
feeling from the very beginning. They were feeling the guilt of this. Remember when they had the 3 days by themselves, and they're thinking, God, this is happening to us we're being detained because of what we did. Like our evil has found us out, even though it had nothing to do with it, at least on the surface. So the brothers plead for forgiveness. And and notice he says, and now please forgive the verse 17, and now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. That's interesting. Notice how they identify themselves. How do they call themselves?
God
They
of your father's servants.
yeah, that's really interesting. So they don't say, please forgive the transgressions of your brothers, Joseph. They are identifying themselves in a different way than we've seen before as the servants of the God of your father. Huh. They don't even say our father. It's like your father. So we're servants of the Lord now. And they're changed men. They really are. I mean, they're as depraved as they were before. They have really changed. God has broken them down, and they are now identifying as truly servants of God of their Father. That's a big deal that they begin to invoke the name of God and identify themselves in that way. I'm going to argue this is real repentance on their part, and faith.
Well, if you put all the pieces together, as Bob was saying, the 3 day, what they were thinking of when they were for those 3 days and so forth, all the pieces certainly point to that way, to a significant change.
Yeah. And I think that the key to the change is, and notice where the repentance began for them was in the exposure when it comes to light. That's what has to happen is they are this long past sin, this skeleton in their closet has been hiding there and they've been keeping from their father and just suppressing. And this evil comes to light and is exposed. That's the key for all of them. Same thing with Judah.
Yeah.
His depraved, it's when he is exposed that he finally comes around and becomes the man of God. I think that's why it's so terrifying. That's why coming to faith is on one hand the easiest thing in the world, and it's also the hardest thing in the world. It's easy, it doesn't require any special talents to become a believer. It doesn't require any special skills, but it does require us to come into the light and to be exposed and that's a terrifying thing to be broken before God like that. And here they are. And the beauty of the story is Joseph's response. And that's key because his response gives a flavor of the way God responds to us, the way the Lord Jesus responds to us. And what's Joseph's response to them? First thing,
Do
First
not
he
fear.
before he says anything,
He wept.
he wept when they spoke to him. And then his brothers fall down before him and say, "Behold, we are your servants." And it's really beautiful. Just the humility. It reminds. Does it not remind you a little bit of the prodigal son? I'm not worthy to be called your son. Take me as one of your servants. And they call the brothers are.
I think it's significant too that he doesn't make light of what they did. He says that you did it for evil,
Yeah.
but God meant it for good.
Yes, I think that's a great point.
Mm.
There's no minimizing of the sin. He doesn't just say, "Ah, don't worry about it. Not a big deal. No harm, no foul." No, it was hard. There was real evil in this. But I love Joseph's response of faith. And he comforted us, "Do not fear." This is a great, I think this passage for people who struggle with bitterness, who have been wounded, betrayed, um, and are dealing with that bitter heart spirit, and you don't, everything in you, you don't want to forgive, because when you forgive someone who's done evil against you, it's like they're getting away with it. That's can't forgive them because that means they've gotten away with it. And I can't give them that. And I'll go to my grave in misery, but I will not give them that comfort. I will not do that for them because then they've gotten away with this. That's the devil's grip, the temptation of the evil one. And I think Joseph really shows us how um how we break that. And look at his mindset. The first thing he says is, "All right, don't fear." And there's several reasons why he can forgive. Um, how Joseph, I'm going to put it this way, how Joseph can forgive such evil. And the first thing he says is what? In verse 19?
I'm in God's place. God has me here.
No, he doesn't.
He said, he says, am I in
Am I
God?
in the place of God? Which is a rhetorical question,
Yes, yes.
which means I'm not in God's place. I'm not the judge.
No, that's not how I was taking that. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I was taking it as God has me in this place, and it surely did. Because it's you can take a little sermon here on first cause. In every situation of life, every single situation of life, in the chain of causation, an all-knowing and all-powerful God who can say yes and it's yes, and he can say no and it's no always. Yeah. He is always the first cause. No matter what the situation is, and he has a good purpose, but he is always the first cause, and that's how I took that. Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? If it's a rhetorical question, I would say yes, it is the place of God. He has me here. He is the first cause in this situation.
Yes, I agree
That's
with
how
that.
I saw it, Rob.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I don't think that's what he means though, because he's comforting them. Don't fear. It is God is the judge. God is the one that you should fear here. I am not your judge. I am not the one who is going to condemn you or judge you here.
Yeah, I could see that too. I could see that that's a possibility.
So, but either way, I mean, I think they kind of both can work, but he is giving them, this sense of comfort. Don't fear, and the acknowledgement of God's sovereignty. And I think we can agree upon that. That's very clear in the whole passage. God's sovereignty. And what do we mean by God's sovereignty, by the way? What does that mean?
He's at the top of the heap.
Yeah. His absolute control over all things at all times.
After 9/11, I heard so many people say God had nothing to do with this. Excuse me? The one who was aware that it was going to occur and could have said no and it doesn't happen, he had no part in the chain of causation.
Yeah, that if he doesn't have anything to do with it, that's terrifying, because that means there is evil run amok.
That's right.
That is beyond his control, and then that's terrifying. The comfort is to know that, look, I don't know why he allowed it or ordained it to happen.
Right.
He is not the perpetrator of the evil. The terrorists were.
Right.
But he had a purpose for all things, and it's a good and look what he says here, that just like with the brothers here, what does he say? You meant evil against me,
But God meant it for good.
but God meant it for good. So you did evil. There's no question about that. God did not do evil. You did evil.
Right.
But God ordained that evil for good. So that whole phrase I've used before, where God plays both sides of the chessboard. He's playing the white pieces of his people. He's playing the black pieces of the devil. He's playing both sides, even though they are the ones who perpetrated this evil. It was their own selfishness. It was their own pride and envy that moved them to do this. Yet that was part of God's plan, because if they
He
hadn't betrayed,
allows it to happen for his purpose.
he allows it. I would go further even and say he ordains it, that he meant it for good. This was part of his plan. It wasn't like they did something evil and God said, "Oh, I gotta figure out what to do with that now."
Right.
It's like he ordains it as well, even though this is the mystery of they're fully responsible. They are not they're not innocent. They can't say, "Well, God made me do it." He didn't make them do it. They did it of their own free will. But God is operating on the other level here where he can, being the creator, the eternal one, can ordain things and move all things according to his purposes. And we see that also in Romans 8:28. God works all things together for good. Another famous passage is, I'm going to throw them down here, Romans 8:28 and Acts 4. If you remember, when it said the disciples are praying and say, God, you indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate conspired with the Jews, Gentiles, against your holy servant Jesus. But they only did what you had ordained should happen. You know,
428.
yeah, 428. Thank you. That is that was God's plan, and that evil people did evil, and they're guilty of it, but yet it was God's plan, because think about it this way, if Joseph's brothers had not betrayed him and had not done evil to him, they all would have died in Canaan, along with the rest of the world when the famine hit. It was their evil that started the chain that saved the world, strangely enough. And you could say the same thing for Christ. It's like if Pontius Pilate and Herod hadn't conspired, along with the Jews and Gentiles, to do the greatest evil of all time, to crucify the Son of God, we would all perish. No one would be saved. So that's the mystery of it. Yeah, Teresa.
Didn't Pontius Pilate say, I find no wrongdoing in this man?
Yeah, which makes it even worse. But he was the one who gave the order to crucify him. It was Pontius Pilate who said he hands him over to them. And he makes that point. Don't you realize I have the power to let you go? And he, even though he knows he's innocent, that's why Pontius Pilate, though he is not as guilty as the Pharisees and Herod are, because they're the one instigating it. He is guilty because he knows that Jesus is innocent, and he just, because of peer pressure, because of fear, whatever, he just executed an innocent man. But without that corruption, we're not saved, because if the righteous Jesus Christ has to die to save us, has to be executed to save us, it will require evil men to do that act, because a righteous judge would never do that. If there were righteous rulers in Israel, the cross would never have happened. This is the mystery of it. Our salvation is actually kind of dependent on evil men.
Acts 2:23 is even the bigger one.
Yeah.
They kind of go together with 428, that he predestined that these things would occur.
Yeah, 2:23. Thank you. I'm going to add that in there. So, and I think that's the key for Joseph to forgive them, is like to know that ultimately God is the one in charge of this here. And even your evil, he works for good. And so I don't have to fear. He sees God's salvation in this. He sees the goodness of God in the midst of their evil. And so therefore, he doesn't resent it, because he sees the plan of it and how God worked it. Even in going back to 9/11, you wonder how could such a thing happen, and why would God ordain such a horrible thing? Well, I mean, lots of horrible things have happened throughout history, far worse than that too.
Mhm.
But we could say, well, one reason might be is that opened up the world to America. We invade these countries and they get exposure. Countries that were completely closed off to Christianity are now flooded with these Christian soldiers and men. It's like, could it be that might be a possibility there, that that might be one of the reasons, is to spread the gospel to some of these places that were completely closed off, but now because they attack us, we suddenly take an interest in them. And who knows? I mean, we're not going to know the full reasons until we're in the presence of the Lord, but we can be assured there are reasons. Things do not just happen without God's purpose involved. And so,
I get saved on my brother's Lou Gehrig's disease.
yeah,
How can Lou Gehrig's disease have any value, any redeeming value, so to speak?
Yeah.
It did.
yeah,
Well, Bob, you said after that you dusted off your Bible.
Yeah. I had to look up the passage that I was hearing somebody say that you could be saved. I didn't even know you could be saved and take it to the bank.
actually, yeah.
Romans 10:9.
And if you think about it, isn't it always the case that it's evil and suffering that brings us to the Lord, that brings people to the Lord? It's like always, and even after 9/11, there was sort of at least for a brief moment, people coming to church, and we actually did have a few people come to church, at least for one Sunday, and soon after forgot. But there's a lot more paying attention to things, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And that evil and suffering like this does bring about God's purposes. So, but then he makes a promise. And so he says, so basically it's for good. And what was the good? So let's talk about that. God's purposes. There's a twofold good in this passage of God using the evil of his brothers to bring Joseph into Egypt. And he says very clearly, what is the purpose of the good? There are two things he mentions.
That many people will be alive, kept alive.
Yes, that many people should be kept alive.
That was through the famine that he's prepared for.
Yeah. Yeah. So because of what they did, God used that betrayal to bring Joseph to a place where he would be in Pharaoh's courts and he could rise to the top, and he with that connection to the one true God, be able to save the world. And that's what they did. Remember, this thing affected the whole world, or at least their world. And people from all the different nations were coming to Egypt to be saved. That's the first thing, that many people should be kept alive in the world. And then he says one more thing of why he's in that position in the promise he gives them in 21.
I'll provide for you and your little ones.
Yeah. That Israel will be provided for. So you can see even there the work of Christ, and just the story of Jesus is so clear here. Betrayed by his own people, by his own brothers, is crucified, dead, and then raised to life and seated at the highest place over all the world. And there he uses his position to save the world and to be a shepherd to his people, to provide for his people, for his little ones. So that's Joseph's in that wonderful place, and that's the word of comfort for them all. Don't fear, don't fear. God has worked all this out to save you and to provide for you, and I will do that. And he comforted them with that. I think that's the way to reconciliation. I think you can't have it aside from the faith and the conviction that God is at work and that God is doing something good, even though you are doing something evil to me, or you've done something evil to me, yet God is working it for my good. And I can trust him, even though I may not trust you. I can trust him and let go of all the bitterness and be free. So, all right, let's finish up the section here. That's our last paragraph of the book here. Jack, would you read for us? Here we go.
So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made his sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt.
All right.
It sounds like Joseph died maybe pretty quick after Jacob.
110 years old. How old was Jacob? Remember how that was? He was
I forgot.
100 and I think
20?
like 5. So and I don't think it was soon after actually, because if Joseph was 110, remember Jacob was old when he had Joseph.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm thinking like Jacob might have been even close to 100 when he had Joseph. And I think he lived like 145. Does that seem about right? 145 years old.
Yep, 140.
So 35 years or so would have passed, you're saying, in these events?
So yeah, at least that much. Maybe more. But because Joseph was a good long time, 110 years. And if it was probably a good 40, 50 years between Jacob's death and Joseph's death. But Joseph lives a full life. That's 110 years. That's pretty darn good.
So I guess after Jacob died, then it sounds like maybe if these events took a while to happen.
Yeah,
And
it's
so
interesting.
they were living under the fear for quite a while, the brothers.
Well, I think that the difference is there's a long period of time between this paragraph that ends in between verses 21 and 22. I think that's where the gap is. There's a long period there, probably several decades, before Joseph dies. So after Jacob dies, they come to him
Yeah. Okay.
and they reconcile, and then it's kind of like they lived happily ever after for the next 60 years or whatever it is, and then Joseph dies. We're told nothing about those years in between. But he lives a full life. It is interesting that the focus is for all the things they did. They must have done tons of things in Egypt, and and Moses doesn't care. He just records their death. And I think that's important for us to note, is he lives a full life. He sees his children and grandchildren. I'm going to guess great-grandchildren, the 3 generations. Is that about right? Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the 3rd generation. So would that be great-great-grandchildren? I'm not sure how many that would be, but in any case, but I want to pay attention to Joseph's final words. And what does he say? Verse 24 and then 25.
About to die, God will visit you and bring you up out of this land. And he makes him swear to take his bones.
He brought together Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob regarding the land, the promise of the land.
Yep.
Yeah. So God will visit you. God will bring you up out of this land. God will bring you to the land he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he says it again. God will visit you. God will surely visit you.
Interestingly, he mentions Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's almost like he's screaming, God's gonna keep the promise that he made through this line.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to
Absolutely.
prove it when it happens, take my bones.
Yes. His final instructions, carry my bones out with you from here when he visits, basically. And that's exactly what happens. This is all the setup now for the next chapter of the story, which is Exodus, when now you're hundreds of years later and God visits, as Joseph believed and proclaimed, and brings them out of the lands, brings them to the land he swore. And if you remember in the end of the book, when they leave, it says in Exodus that Moses, they took the bones of Joseph with them as they were heading out. So they kept that promise to him. So they put him in the coffin, and there you go. So it's interesting. So Joseph remains in Egypt, but Jacob is buried in Canaan right away. I don't know. Any thoughts on that? Why wouldn't Jacob say, don't make a big fuss, just bury me here, and then when you leave, you can take me out with you? I wonder about that. What do you think? Why would it be that Jacob had to be buried in the land of Canaan right away, and Joseph is planning on just take me with you when the Lord visits? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, it seems like he wants to go back. This is the promised land. This is where he wants to be buried. But
Yep.
at the same time, I mean, God brought him here to do good, and the families are still there. So he's not in a
Yeah,
hurry
but
to get back.
but when he dies, but why? The question is, why doesn't Joseph have a burial like Jacob did and go right and be buried right in the promised land like Jacob was? Why does he say, just, bury me here or put me in a coffin here and then carry my bones out with you when the Lord visits?
He didn't have anybody advocating for him the way Joseph advocated for Jacob Joseph was still kind of not a leader, but a
Oh, that's a good point.
ranking official in Egypt, but there was nobody left then to push that narrative.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, practically speaking, you're probably correct with that. Although, he could have maybe requested it of him, but I want to emphasize here, how does the book end with who God is? God gives his name. You're going to see that throughout the scriptures where God is identified with a person. God, this is the God of Abraham, this is the God of Shem. But from this point on, when God appears to Moses, do you remember how he refers to himself when he appears to Moses? I'm the Lord, the God of
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he doesn't add Joseph. It's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so who's buried in the land of Canaan?
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah.
Well, and Jesus didn't come from the line of Joseph.
No, you're right. You're right. He came from the line of Judah, remember, which is Leah is the one buried in that tomb, not Rachel. So you're correct. So it's clear that the covenant name is not Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Joseph. It's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so it's almost like as soon as Jacob dies, it's like it just kind of puts the finishing touch on that, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are there in the land that God promised them. And God never gave that covenant promise to anyone else. He appears to Abraham, gives him that promise, if you remember. Several times he speaks to him like that. Does the same thing for Isaac. He appears to Isaac, gives him that promise again. And then he appeared to Jacob and gave him that promise again. He doesn't appear like that to anybody else after that. Those are the three.
Well, for those, they were promised that their heirs would inherit the land, the people, the world will be benefited by them. But like after that, I mean, Joseph was a tool that God used to create his nation. Okay, separated, growing, and then from then on, the next one you hit was like with hold on, my Moses. I mean, Moses wasn't in his line either.
Yeah.
But Moses was a significant leader to bring the people out. So he used others, but they weren't the covenant line. They weren't the ones that this
Yeah.
was being pledged to.
Yes, I don't think he's ever called the God of Moses either.
No.
He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, the Lord. He will speak through Moses. And that's why when we come to the new covenant, Paul begins his letters not with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ." That's all of it points us to Christ. He is the one through whom we know the one true God. So, all right. Well, that completes Genesis, I think. Any last comments or thoughts on the text or any of the things we've covered?
Just a general observation. The book establishes that God is a promise keeper. I think about all the times that the promise that he made to Abraham could have failed.
Yeah.
You know, when Abimelech takes Sarah and you know, when Reuben and Levi,
Yep.
you know, were straight shooters before they were outruled. All kinds of situations where the promise could have failed.
Yep.
And yet it over and over again, the promise is saved, for lack of a better term. And it's almost like God saying, do you have any other questions? Okay,
Yeah.
I'll see you the next time that it looks like it might fail. And just when you think it's going to fail, there's a way out. And he says again, do you have any questions?
Yeah, and he keeps his promise against all odds. And when everything looks like it's going to fall apart, he keeps his promise. You're absolutely right. I think that's a major, that's what faith is about, isn't it? Faith is trusting in God's promises. He made real promises that we take to the bank and we build our lives on.
Yes.
And one of those promises, as we mentioned, is that he works all things together for our good of those who love him. And therefore we need never fear. And his promise to save us through Christ, I mean, it's just, yeah, he is faithful.
Because I live, you're going to live. That's worth trusting.
Yeah.
in
And from-
that environment.
And from our point of view, looking back and reading this, you've said several times that you know, something has happened in a way that nobody would have written the story this way. You know, no, who's going to write the story that, oh, well, all of his brothers, all of Joseph's brothers, you know, wanted nothing to do with him, even to the point where a lot of them wanted him to be killed, and then they end up selling him off into slavery. That you wouldn't write a story like that and say, oh, but that's the savior of the world at that point.
Yeah.
You know, it's easier to look back and say these are real stories because no one would have made it up.
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
It's almost like there's no heroes in Genesis. I mean, Joseph is pretty impressive what he's able to endure, but the actions that people take are almost always evil and wrong and stupid. And yeah,
And yet,
the book is not about our faithfulness, is it? It's about God's faithfulness to his promises. And that's what gives us hope and encouragement. Because I think as you read the stories again, you can see yourself in the characters too. I can see myself. I can see I look at the self-righteousness, the pride of a Judah, the violence, the bitterness, and the rage of Simeon and Levi, and the arrogance. I can see the frailties of these guys and their despair and their cowardice throughout. And I'm like, yeah, I can see all that in me. That's for sure. That's for sure. And these are the people that God saved because of his promises. So I'm like, okay, that gives me some hope. It gives me some encouragement.
And that was a good point, Bob. You know, if this was a concocted story, a myth, for lack of a better term, the story would have been a lot cleaner. You know, the complexity of some of these stories, as you just said, Bob, no one can make this stuff up.
Yeah.
It's kind of this level of complexity.
Yeah.
No.
So, well, that completes it. Any other last comments here? And it's great having you. We survived. I can't believe we got through Genesis finally. Took a while, but we did it. So I'm gonna stop recording here.